This is the Velotric Packer 1 eCargo bike that I've been riding around for the past couple of months. And in this video, we're going to take a close look at the specs and perhaps answer the question of whether or not an eCargo bike is right for you. So this bike was sent to the channel for review, but it's very different from the Velotric T1 ST video that I did a while back. Now this is the Packer 1 version, which is classified as a long-tail e-cargo bike, as opposed to a front-loading style cargo bike. It's powered by a beefy 750 watt hub motor and a 690 watt-hour battery, good for up to a claimed 52 miles per charge. Now for us, we've been using it to transport two little kids with a combined weight of about 90 pounds to and from school. And I personally prefer to use the highest assist level, and I use the throttle lever and I don't even pedal. Now in this real world configuration, we've been getting closer to 30 miles per charge, which is still pretty decent given the load. Now the bike tops out at 20 miles per hour in stock form, but it's also unlockable to 25 miles an hour if you want the extra speed. Now the bike weighs in at 75 pounds, but I did have to take Velotric's word on this. There's just no way I was going to be able to hang this bike on my scale. It's got a 175 pound rear rack load capacity and a maximum bike load, which is the rider plus all the cargo, of 440 pounds, which is a lot. Although I can't imagine being able to control the bike very well in this loaded state. Now the 8-speed Shimano drivetrain is pretty basic, but the brakes are another story. Front and rear 4-piston hydraulic brakes with 180mm rotors do a really good job of stopping this bike even when it's loaded down. Now technically the bike is a mullet in that it's got a 26 by 2.4 inch tire up front and a 20 by 3 inch tire in the rear. It's also got a suspension fork with a functional lockout. The display is nice and clean, it's low profile, and it clearly displays the current speed, trip meter, battery level, and assist level, along with a few other key metrics. It's also backlit and really easy to read at any time of day. Now, as far as bells and whistles, there's an integrated headlight and tail light with a brake light feature, a thumb throttle lever, a solid 2-leg kickstand, Apple Find My integration, a 5-volt USB charging port, and an actual bell. Now, I've never ridden an e-bike this large before, and so it took a couple of laps around the block to get used to. Now, obviously, the biggest difference is the rear chainstay length, which is almost twice that of a normal bike. It's also much heavier than a regular bike, and combined, these two differences kind of force you to ride a little bit differently. Now, the power delivery is based on a cadence sensor, and so it's not as smooth as a drive system that employs torque sensor-based power. But honestly, I primarily ride this bike using the thumb throttle lever. So it's really more like an electric moped than a bicycle. And yes, it's a lot of fun. Now the bike came with all the accessories, which include seat pads for passengers, footboards for comfort, a set of handlebars for a rear passenger, a child safety balustrade, I don't know how you say that. It's basically like a cage that surrounds a passenger. Came with a large rear basket, a small rear basket, and a front basket rack. Now we've had the front basket mounted from day one, but in the rear you've got some options. You can set it up for pure cargo with the large basket, or you can have the small rear basket and one passenger seat, or in our case we've had it set up with the 2 seat pads and the kid cage, since 90% of the time we're using it to get our 2 little kids to and from school. Now it goes without saying that they love it, and they're actually excited for their morning commute to school, which is only about 3/4 of a mile, but it corresponds to about a 15-minute walk. Now with the Packer, we can get to school in under 3 minutes, and aside from buckling their helmets, we basically just have to hop on and go. Now if you're curious, my kids are ages 5 and 7 and have a combined weight of around 90 pounds, which is well within the weight limit. Now perhaps the best part about commuting to school by bike is avoiding the car line, which generally wraps around the block and can take up to 15 minutes to get through on some days. Now in our case, we just ride up to the gate and off they go. Now if you have school-age kids and this is something that you're considering, I will share a couple of things about my experience so far. Now the first is, well, we're definitely the only family in this school who commutes this way. And so it goes without saying that we get a lot of looks and a lot of attention. Now, I was definitely uncomfortable with this at first, but as with most things, people kind of get used to it, and now it doesn't really bug me as much. Now, the second thing that's worth mentioning is that unlike riding a regular bike, the Velotric Packer 1 is just too big to safely ride on the sidewalk with other pedestrians, which means that we're riding in the street with all the cars. Now initially I was on the fence about this because it certainly introduces some element of risk, but so far we've been just fine as long as we're cautious and defensive almost, in most cases waiting for cars to pass until it's clear. Now thankfully our neighborhood is pretty quiet and we only have to cross one main street for which there's always a crossing guard for increased visibility. Now, our strategy so far has just been to adjust our schedule slightly to avoid the densest part of the rush in the morning and the afternoon, which means getting to school just a few minutes earlier and leaving school just a few minutes later, which has honestly made all the difference in the amount of congestion right in front of the school. Now, we've been using this bike primarily as a kid hauler, but there are, of course, many other uses. And so I'll just zoom out a little bit and focus on some things to consider regardless of how you might use this bike. Now, the first one is something I didn't even consider until I saw just how big the bike is. And that's the fact that you kind of need to live in an area that's at least semi-bikeable, because you're not really going to load this bike onto any normal car rack. It's just too long. Now, I suppose if you have a pickup truck with a long bed, you could roll it up there and tie it down, but I think for the most part, the owner of this bike will primarily go on trips that begin and end at their home, which also means you'll need a secure place to store the bike on the ground floor, or make sure that your building's elevator is big enough to fit the bike if you live in a condo or an apartment building. Now, another thing to consider is the weight distribution. The weight limit for the front rack is 15 kilograms or about 33 pounds, which is a lot of weight on the front end of the bike. Now, with this amount of weight, it actually compresses the front suspension significantly, which effectively steepens the head tube angle, which can make the bike a little bit harder to control. Now, my advice would be if you're gonna weight the front of the bike, you should definitely use the lockout on the fork just to retain the bike's composure while riding. And then lastly, if you've never ridden a big eCargo bike like this before, make sure to start with the seat low enough such that both feet can comfortably reach the ground. Now, I realize that may sound obvious, but once you start loading this bike with any significant amount of weight, like two little kids excitedly bouncing around, it's much more unwieldy. So, who is this bike for? Well, that's actually kind of a tough one, mostly because this bike is so versatile. Now, it can certainly be a car replacement, at least for local errands. But of course, you have to be comfortable with the idea that this bike is basically tethered to your home. It's highly unlikely that you'll realistically pack this bike up on a car and drive somewhere with it. Also, if you're not super comfortable on a bike to begin with, a bike like the Packer One can be a bit of a handful just due to its weight. Now, my wife, who isn't a cyclist per se, but who can comfortably ride a bike, actually has some trouble controlling the Packer with both kids on the back, and she actually prefers not to use it to take the kids to school anymore. She's just not confident enough to navigate the morning and afternoon rush. You'll also need a lot of space to store the bike. Now, we are fortunate enough to live in a single-family home with space in the garage, but I completely get that not everybody has the required space available. So I suppose, despite how versatile the bike is, there is a somewhat narrow customer base for a bike like this. And it's just important to consider all these factors before making the purchase. Now, I will say that the bike is remarkably refined. And I still believe that in a sea of lesser-known e-bike companies, Velotric continues to stand out as an upper-tier direct-to-consumer brand, with solid customer support and a thoughtful fleet of e-bike offerings. The build quality of both Velotric bikes that I've reviewed is top-notch, and the only damage that I can report is a bent rear derailleur hanger on the Packer, which was an easy fix. Now, according to the bike's odometer, we've ridden a total of about 50 miles, which corresponds to about 68 trips, or 34 round trips to and from school, with most days requiring a common drop-off, but two separate pickups. Now, I estimate that a one-way trip to school on the Packer saves on average about 8 minutes when you factor in buckling, parking, unbuckling, and then walking to the gate if you drive a car, which by my calculation means that over the past 4 weeks of school, we've saved over 9 hours of commute time, which on its own makes the whole thing worth it in my opinion. In any case, questionable math aside, it certainly relieved us from sitting in the dreaded car line at pickup and drop off. And as far as I can tell, we'll continue to use this bike until the kids get too heavy or until they get too cool to show up to school on a bike with their dad. You know, I'm not actually sure which of those is going to happen first. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.